Florida, in the late 1980s, was a place where it was easy to disappear. Endless highways stretched across pine forests, dark swamps, and miles of road where a car could pull over. The engine shut off, and no one would notice. This was a Florida of people passing through, not people staying long-haul drivers, tourists, seasonal workers, people whose absence often went unnoticed for days, sometimes weeks. Within that landscape, the first death appeared as an isolated event, barely causing a ripple. A middle-aged man was found dead along the side of a highway. He had been shot. His car was gone. His wallet missing? No witnesses? No signs that the victim knew his killer. The report was filed quickly. A robbery turned homicide. A familiar conclusion. A few weeks later, another body appeared in a different county. Similar circumstances, another man, another gun, another deserted stretch of road. Again, no witnesses. The two deaths were never placed side by side. There was no reason to. Two different counties, two different police departments, two separate investigative teams, two case files placed into two filing cabinets that would never touch. At the time, there were no algorithms, no effective inter-county data systems, no national database capable of flagging that these deaths might belong to the same pattern. American criminal investigations in the late 1980s still relied heavily on human intuition and geographic boundaries. If a killer wanted to avoid detection, intelligence was not essential. Movement was. As the deaths continued through 1989 and into early 1990, each one was similar enough to unsettle, but not similar enough to force the system to acknowledge something larger was unfolding. Each time a body was found, the story began anew, as if there were no past. The victims did not know one another. They did not share professions, social circles, or lifestyles. They had no financial or personal connection. The only thing they shared was that they died on the road. In investigative meetings, the possibility of a serial killer was rarely raised, and when it was quickly dismissed. There was no signature, no ritual, no display, nothing recognizable to analysts trained on traditional serial homicide models. If this was a serial killer, it was one who did not want to be seen. Throughout this period, the name Aileen Wuornos did not appear in any reports. She was not on a watch list. She had no criminal history severe enough to place her on any radar as a potential suspect. She existed in a social gray zone where people lived day to day, leaving no long-term trail. Wuornos was a homeless woman. No stable address, no steady employment, no bank account, a life that made tracking nearly impossible in a system designed to monitor people who had something to lose. In Florida at the time, Wuornos was not unusual. Thousands of people lived parallel lives at society's edge, unseen, undocumented, and unprotected. As the murders continued, some investigators began to feel something was wrong. The similarities were too persistent to be entirely random, but intuition alone was not enough to trigger a systemic response. Part of the problem lay in an invisible bias. When investigators imagined the killer, they imagined a man with a violent past, a man who hunted, a man comfortable with firearms. No one sketched the profile of a woman standing roadside, hitchhiking. The idea did not fit the thinking of the era. The truth is, had Wuornos been male, the pattern might have been recognized sooner, not because men are inherently more suspicious, but because the system had been trained to look for them. In the early forensic reports, key details existed, but they were never read together. Bullet trajectories, firing distance, body positioning. Some scenes showed signs of struggle. Others did not. There was no absolute consistency. That inconsistency led to a dangerous assumption. Perhaps there were multiple killers, or unrelated robberies, or random violence. Those assumptions allowed the system to continue operating without changing its approach. Meanwhile, Wuornos kept moving, kept surviving, kept encountering men along the highways. In later testimony, she would describe those encounters as moments of intense tension, where the line between survival and violence was razor thin. But while the murders were happening, no one was listening. The turning point did not come from forensic brilliance. It came from a human mistake. Wuornos began using victims' property, cars, credit cards, personal belongings, items a careful killer would avoid. It was not because she was careless. It was because she had no alternatives, no money, no steady income, no long-term plan. Decisions made under survival pressure are rarely strategic, and those decisions left traces. When a vehicle was found being used by someone other than its owner, when suspicious transactions surfaced, fragments began to align. Not all at once, but enough for certain investigators to revisit older cases with different eyes. Aileen Wuornos' name entered official records not as a murder suspect, but as someone using stolen property, a small detail, a seemingly minor point. But it was the beginning of collapse. Once Wuornos was arrested, the murders, once treated as isolated, were placed side by side. The similarities became undeniable. What had the system missed? And, more importantly, how many deaths might have been prevented had those connections been recognized sooner? When the murders were finally assembled into a single sequence after Aileen Wuornos' arrest, the American justice system confronted an uncomfortable paradox. The conclusion had been reached before the data was fully read. In that posture, forensics, often treated as the objective backbone of justice, no longer functioned as a tool for discovering truth, but as an instrument for reinforcing a story that had already been chosen. The earliest forensic reports were written while the cases were still considered separate incidents. Each report served a single homicide, not a pattern. That detail may sound technical, but in investigative terms it created a dangerous blind spot. Forensics is not merely about interpreting one scene. It is about placing scenes side by side. In the Wuornos case, that did not happen until it was too late. All of the victims died from gunshot wounds, but the number of shots, the points of impact, and the trajectories were not perfectly consistent. Some victims were shot at very close range, others from farther away. Some bodies were found face down, others face up. Some scenes suggested a struggle, others did not. In traditional investigative logic, such inconsistency is usually read in one of two ways. Either there are multiple offenders or there are multiple circumstances. Both interpretations dilute the likelihood of a single serial offender. But there was a third possibility, rarely articulated and never seriously pursued in this case. A single offender acting in different psychological states. Later internal discussions among behavioral analysts acknowledged that the role of moment-to-moment psychological state had been underestimated. Wuornos did not kill according to a ritual. She reacted, and reaction, by its nature, is inconsistent. Forensics can measure bullet trajectory. It cannot measure fear. One of the most contested elements in the Wuornos file is firing distance. In several cases, gunshot residue indicated that the shots were fired at close range. Prosecutors repeatedly framed this as evidence of execution. Style killing, cold, deliberate, intentional. But in other contexts, close-range firing can also indicate panic. When a person believes they are under imminent threat, self-defensive reactions often involve firing at close range, without precise aim, without calculation. The distinction between these interpretations is not academic. It determines whether an act is understood as premeditated murder or as violent response under extreme stress. In the courtroom, that complexity was not prioritized. The prosecution needed a coherent narrative. A serial killer who hunted victims, shot them, and stole their property. That story was clear, persuasive, and easily understood by a jury. Forensic details that did not align neatly with that narrative were treated as anomalies rather than signals. One recurring example involved body positioning. In some cases, victims were found in postures inconsistent with being attacked from behind without warning. Certain wound patterns suggested face-to-face confrontation. That raised a question. Had there been an exchange? Had there been escalation? In the official case record, the question appears briefly and then disappears. When Wuornos began to confess, inconsistencies in her statements were immediately framed as evidence of deception. But from a psychological standpoint, those inconsistencies could also indicate fragmented memory. People who endure severe trauma rarely recount events in linear fashion. Memory surfaces in fragments. Emotion overrides chronology. Temporal sequence becomes distorted. Wuornos sometimes claimed self-defense. At other times, she admitted killing for money. She shifted between accounts. To the public, this proved dishonesty. To trauma specialists, it suggested a persistent sense of threat. In interrogation rooms, that sense of threat was not examined. It was reduced to a conclusion. Wuornos was unreliable. But in criminal investigation, unreliable does not mean meaningless. One of the most significant failures in the Wuornos case was the absence of a comprehensive, independent, long-term psychological evaluation before irreversible legal decisions were made. Wuornos was deemed competent to stand trial, but competence does not mean psychological stability, nor does it mean that statements can be interpreted simplistically. Subsequent medical reviews pointed to severe personality pathology combined with paranoid features and complex trauma. These were not mild diagnoses. They directly affect threat perception. If a person believes the world is perpetually dangerous, the line between defense and offense collapses. Forensics cannot quantify that, but the legal system can consider it. In this case, it did not. Another overlooked detail was timing. Some shootings occurred during daylight hours, others at night. This inconsistency undermines the image of a predator operating with careful planning. It aligns more closely with reactive behavior shaped by circumstance and mental state. If Wuornos were methodically hunting, why not choose consistent locations and times? Why expose herself to detection risk? The answer may be simple. She did not fully control her behavior. In court, these questions were never pursued. The prosecution did not need nuance. A death sentence requires certainty, not complexity. Jurors were shown crime scene photos, heard the victim count, and watched a defendant whose emotional regulation visibly collapsed. They were not asked to become psychologists. They were asked to deliver moral judgment. Did Wuornos kill? Yes, that was enough. But for investigators and scholars who later re-examined the case, that answer has never sufficed. The forensic evidence in the Wuornos case was not falsified. There is no indication it was manipulated. The failure lay in interpretation and in what the system chose not to interpret. Once Wuornos was sentenced, the forensic files were closed. There was no incentive to revisit them, no institutional appetite for alternative readings. In this case, capital punishment did more than end a life. It ended inquiry. In every major criminal case, there comes a point when the question of who did it is no longer sufficient. With Aileen Wuornos, that point arrived early. Once her name surfaced in headlines, investigators and the public alike knew who had pulled the trigger. What they did not know, and did not truly want to know, was how a person arrives at that point. Wuornos' psychological record is not a clean folder of diagnoses. It is a long chain of fractures stretching from early childhood into adulthood, where each stage added another layer of damage until the structure of personality itself could no longer self-regulate. Wuornos did not become dangerous in her 30s. She was formed that way over time. According to social service records and later testimony, Aileen Wuornos was born into a family that barely existed. Her father was convicted of sexual offenses and later died by suicide in prison. Her mother abandoned her when Wuornos was still a small child. From the beginning, abandonment was not an event, it was a condition. She was raised by her grandparents in an environment where stability was never guaranteed. Reports indicate she experienced both physical and psychological abuse. But like many abuse records of that era, these reports existed only on paper. There was no sustained intervention, no therapy, no long-term monitoring of the damage being done. Modern psychological analysis would later classify this as complex trauma, trauma not caused by a single incident, but by repeated exposure to violence, neglect, and fear throughout developmental years. A child raised in such conditions does not learn that the world is predictable. They learn that the world must be anticipated, guarded against, survived. Wuornos left her family environment early, in every sense of the word. She lived without stable housing, without completed education, without consistent adult protection. At the age when many people are forming identity and trust, Wuornos was forming survival strategies. One of those strategies was street-level sex work. In later statements, Wuornos described prostitution not as a choice, but as inevitability. It was how she earned money, how she found places to sleep, how she remained alive in a world that offered no alternatives. For many, prostitution is dangerous. For Wuornos, it was a continuation of childhood violence, except now the violence was normalized, expected, and repeated daily. Psychological studies show that individuals subjected to continuous bodily violation often develop a distorted relationship with violence. Violence ceases to be abnormal. It becomes familiar. In Wuornos' case, violence did not come only from clients. It came from law enforcement, from short jail stays, from repeated arrests for minor offenses followed by release without support. Each encounter reinforced a single message: no one was responsible for her safety. Over time, Wuornos developed psychological traits that later became the subject of intense debate. Diagnoses included borderline personality disorder, antisocial traits, and paranoid features. These labels may be clinically accurate, but they do not fully convey lived experience. Wuornos existed in a state of near constant hypervigilance. She believed danger was everywhere. For someone repeatedly harmed, that belief is not irrational. It is experiential. The problem arises when every situation is perceived as a threat. When Wuornos described the killings as acts of self-defense, many dismissed the claim outright. But from a psychological standpoint, what matters is not only whether the threat was objectively real, but whether she believed it was real. A person living in chronic fear reacts faster, harder, and with less discrimination between potential and actual danger. When that reaction intersects with access to a firearm, the outcome can be lethal. During interrogations, Wuornos shifted rapidly between cooperation and rage, clarity, and paranoia. These fluctuations were often interpreted as manipulation. Trauma specialists see them as signs of emotional dysregulation. Notably, throughout the years leading up to the murders, Wuornos had repeated contact with legal and social systems. She was not invisible, but every encounter ended the same way: surface-level processing, no deeper intervention. There was no sustained mental health care, no mandatory treatment, no meaningful reintegration effort. Wuornos was treated as a problem individual, not as a person sliding toward danger. By the time the murders occurred, the system described her as a monster. But monsters do not emerge spontaneously. They are shaped incrementally through neglect compounded by violence. Later in life, Wuornos began speaking about mind control and invisible forces. These statements were widely cited as proof of madness. Clinically, delusions rarely appear suddenly. They emerge when reality testing has eroded over time. By then, Wuornos was no longer someone to be treated. She had become a symbol, and symbols are not meant to be understood. They are meant to be eliminated. By the time Aileen Wuornos entered the courtroom, her case was no longer a purely criminal matter. It had become a national narrative, a symbol, a test of the American justice system's ability to confront something it rarely had to confront: a woman, poor, violent, and incompatible with any familiar moral archetype. In cases like this, a trial is not merely a forum for establishing facts. It is a place where one story is chosen to be believed. From the outset, the prosecution's strategy was unmistakable. Wuornos was not presented as a complex human being shaped by prolonged trauma. She was presented as a deliberate serial killer, a highway predator who hunted men, shot them, and stole their property. Every detail selected for the courtroom reinforced that image. The prosecution did not need to prove that Wuornos was responsible for the deaths. That was uncontested. What they needed to prove was that she deserved the harshest punishment available. To achieve that, any element capable of introducing ambiguity or empathy had to be neutralized. Claims of self-defense were framed as fabrication. Contradictions in Wuornos' statements were presented as proof of dishonesty. Her history of sexual abuse and violence was acknowledged only superficially, as background color rather than as a factor with the power to alter interpretation. In the courtroom, far more time was devoted to describing bodies than to examining the years Wuornos spent homeless, assaulted, and unprotected. Defense attorneys faced an almost impossible task. They could not deny the killings. They could not transform Wuornos into an innocent victim. Their only viable strategy was to create space for complexity, to question mental state, perception of threat, and the cumulative effects of trauma. But complexity is fragile in a courtroom saturated with fear. Media coverage had already set the tone. Before the trial began, Wuornos had been assigned a label that no defense attorney could erase: America's female serial killer. The phrase appeared in headlines, television segments, and public consciousness. That label did more than describe behavior. It defined identity. Once a defendant is framed that way, every action in court is interpreted against them. Anger becomes evidence of savagery. Silence becomes proof of coldness. Emotional instability becomes confirmation of danger. Wuornos could not perform the role of the good defendant. She was not calm, not deferential, not composed in a way that invited sympathy. Her outbursts, interruptions, and erratic statements played directly into the prosecution's narrative. Few in the courtroom asked whether a person with such extensive trauma could realistically regulate emotion under extreme pressure. One of the most contentious aspects of the proceedings was Wuornos' repeated refusal to continue appeals and her expressed desire to accept execution. She stated that she wanted it to be over. She said the system would never be fair. She said she was exhausted. Legally, these statements were treated as evidence of competence and voluntary choice. Psychologically, many experts later argued they could just as easily represent profound despair, a person who no longer believed survival was possible. Throughout the trial, questions of systemic responsibility were conspicuously absent. No one stood trial for failing a child subjected to abuse. No institution was questioned for repeatedly releasing a woman with severe psychological instability back onto the streets without support. Courts are not designed to prosecute societies. They prosecute individuals, in this case, focusing all responsibility on one individual restored a sense of order. There was an identifiable villain, a punishment, a conclusion. The media continued to reinforce that structure. Sensational details were repeated. Psychological analysis was simplified. Wuornos was portrayed as an aberration, a terrifying exception within American criminal history. Rarely did coverage ask what conditions allowed such an exception to develop. When the death sentence was delivered, many experienced relief. Victims' families were granted closure. The public felt safer. The system produced a definitive answer. But for those who would later revisit the case with investigative distance, that verdict marked something else: the closure of inquiry. Once Wuornos was sentenced to death and later executed, remaining questions lost legal relevance. There was no defendant to examine further, no incentive to reconsider, no institutional pressure to confront gray areas. The trial fulfilled its legal purpose, but it did so by simplifying a reality that resisted simplification. As Aileen Wuornos entered the final years of her life on Florida's death row, her case was, in legal terms, nearly complete. Verdicts had been handed down. Appeals were denied one by one. For the justice system, Wuornos had become a file approaching administrative closure. For American society, however, this was the moment when the most difficult questions began to surface. Wuornos did not wait for a legal miracle. On the contrary, she increasingly insisted on abandoning further appeals. In public statements, she said she wanted to be executed. She said the system would never be fair to her. She said she was tired of being examined, evaluated, turned into a subject of endless debate. Those statements were accepted by the courts as proof of competence and voluntary choice. Procedurally, Wuornos was deemed capable of waiving the final safeguards meant to preserve her life. Among mental health professionals, the decision produced deep unease. Could a person with a history of extreme trauma, personality disorder, paranoia, and psychological deterioration truly be making a free and rational choice? Or was this the final expression of a life worn down to the point where imagining a future was no longer possible? That question was never resolved in court. It lay outside the boundaries of law, but squarely within the boundaries of ethics. In her final months, Wuornos' statements grew increasingly disordered. She spoke of being poisoned, of invisible forces, of government control and surveillance. These claims were widely circulated by the media as confirmation of madness, reinforcing the belief that execution was justified. Few asked why such clear signs of psychological collapse did not trigger a more rigorous reassessment of her mental state. The answer was embedded in the logic of capital punishment itself. Once the legal process reaches its final stage, the system discourages interruption. Delay is treated as obstruction. Reconsideration is seen as weakness. Wuornos' execution took place quietly. There was no spectacle, no public ceremony, a lethal injection, a time of death recorded. The state of Florida declared justice served. Yet Wuornos' death did not close the case in the way many expected. Instead, it opened a prolonged period of re-examination in which attention shifted from what she had done to what had been done, and not done before the killings ever occurred. With distance came analysis. Criminologists, psychologists, and sociologists revisited the case not as a singular horror, but as a convergence of forces: gendered violence, poverty, sexual abuse, untreated trauma, and systemic neglect. One conclusion emerged repeatedly: Wuornos did not fit the classic serial killer model. There was no evidence she killed for pleasure, dominance, or ritualized control. There was no meticulous planning or consistent signature. Her violence appeared reactive, chaotic, and inseparable from circumstance. This did not mitigate the gravity of the crimes, but it reframed their origins. In academic literature, Wuornos became an extreme example of trauma-driven violence, where the boundary between offender and victim blurred, not because guilt vanished, but because causality grew complex. A persistent question followed: had Wuornos been male, would her claims of self-defense have been treated differently? Had the victims been women, would the narrative have shifted? There are no definitive answers, but the fact that such questions endure reveals how deeply the case unsettled assumptions about gender and violence in America. Another aspect of Wuornos' legacy lies in media portrayal. For years, her image was recycled as shorthand for the sensational idea of a female serial killer. Films, books, and television programs emphasized aberration and shock value, often stripping the story of context. That framing produced entertainment, but it also reinforced a dangerous illusion that cases like Wuornos are rare anomalies, disconnected from broader social conditions. In reality, the factors that shaped her poverty, abuse, instability, lack of mental health support are not rare at all. They exist across the country in varying degrees, largely invisible, until they erupt. What was rare was not the presence of those factors, but their convergence within a single individual until violence became impossible to ignore. Capital punishment, in this context, offered a false sense of closure. It ended a life without addressing the conditions that produced it. It treated the symptom, not the disease. For investigators and scholars who continue to examine the Wuornos case, its most troubling legacy is not the number of victims, but the number of missed opportunities before the first shot was fired. Moments of contact with social services, encounters with law enforcement, warnings that were processed, filed, and forgotten. Wuornos did not emerge suddenly, weapon in hand. She traveled a long road to that point. Along that road were countless chances for intervention, none of which succeeded. From the vantage point of history, the most unsettling truth is this: nothing about this case was entirely unpredictable. Aileen Wuornos died in an execution chamber, but her story persists as a quiet indictment, not of monsters hiding in society, but of people abandoned until they become what society fears most. And that is the final question the case leaves behind, not for courts, but for a nation that equates justice with punishment. Can a society call itself just if it only acts after it is already too late?